For 28 years, I poured my heart into raising my son Daniel, working 3 jobs to put him through college, sacrificing my own dreams so he could have everything I never did. But when my daughter-in-law Jessica looked me dead in the eye at Thanksgiving dinner and said I didn't need a full plate at my age because older people eat less, I realized it was time she learned exactly who owned the roof over her ungrateful head. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Mitchell, and at 62 years old, I thought I had seen every form of disrespect this world could offer. I was wrong. The moment that shattered everything I believed about family happened on a crisp November evening, surrounded by the warm glow of candles and the rich aroma of turkey and stuffing. What should have been a celebration of gratitude became the night I discovered just how little my own family valued me. I had spent 3 days preparing for Thanksgiving dinner. Every dish was made from scratch, just the way my late mother taught me. The turkey had been brining since Monday, the cranberry sauce simmered with fresh oranges and cinnamon, and the sweet potato casserole topped with my signature pecan crumble that Daniel used to beg for when he was little. The dining room table gleamed under my grandmother's antique chandelier, set with the good china that had been in our family for generations. Daniel arrived first with Jessica, his wife of 5 years, and their 2 children, Emma, who was 7, and little Marcus, who had just turned 4. Jessica swept into my home like she owned the place, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floors I had spent hours polishing. She barely acknowledged my greeting, instead immediately launching into complaints about the traffic and how early they had to wake up the children. I brushed off her attitude, focusing instead on my grandchildren, who threw themselves into my arms with genuine excitement. Emma chattered about her school play while Marcus showed me a drawing he had made of our family. These moments with them made every slight from their mother worth enduring. They were innocent in all of this, and I refused to let adult drama taint their childhood memories. My younger son Thomas arrived shortly after with his girlfriend Rachel, a sweet kindergarten teacher who always offered to help in the kitchen. Unlike Jessica, Rachel appreciated the effort that went into these family gatherings. She complimented every dish and genuinely seemed interested in learning family recipes. The contrast between the 2 women couldn't have been starker. As we gathered around the table, I felt a familiar warmth in my chest. This was what I had worked so hard to create, what had driven me through those exhausting years of single motherhood after my husband left when the boys were teenagers. Every sacrifice, every missed social event, every dollar stretched until it screamed had been for moments like these. I had prepared generous portions for everyone, knowing that leftovers were part of the Thanksgiving tradition. The children's plates were filled with their favorites, while the adults received hearty servings befitting a holiday feast. When I reached for Jessica's plate to serve her, she held up her hand with a patronizing smile. "Oh, Eleanor, you don't need to give me so much. Actually, you probably don't need such a big portion either at your age. Older people don't eat as much, and you should be watching your figure. It's not healthy to overeat when you're past 60. The words hit me like a physical blow. The serving spoon trembled in my hand as I processed what she had just said. Not only had she insulted my age and my body, but she had done it in front of my grandchildren, in my own home, at a table laden with food I had spent days preparing. The room fell silent except for the soft clink of silverware as everyone froze. Thomas's eyes widened in shock, while Rachel looked mortified. Even the children sensed the tension, their innocent chatter dying away. Daniel, my own son, the boy I had sacrificed everything for, simply looked uncomfortable and said nothing. I set down the serving spoon with deliberate care, my mind racing. 28 years of memories flashed before me. Daniel as a colicky baby when I walked the floors, alone while his father worked late. The times I went without dinner so there would be enough food for growing boys. Working double shifts at the diner while taking night classes to become a certified bookkeeper, all so I could provide better for my children. selling my grandmother's jewelry to pay for Daniel's college tuition when his father stopped sending support checks. Through it all, I had never asked for gratitude. I had never demanded recognition. I had simply loved my children and done what needed to be done. But this casual cruelty delivered with a smile while she sat at my table, in my house, eating my food? This was beyond anything I had imagined. "I see," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Well then, I suppose I should be more mindful of appropriate portions." Jessica's smile widened, apparently pleased that I had accepted her criticism so gracefully. She had no idea that behind my calm exterior, something fundamental had shifted. A line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. I served myself a modest portion and took my seat at the head of the table, the same spot where I had presided over thousands of family meals. But this time felt different. I studied the faces around me with new eyes, seeing things I had been too loving, too hopeful to notice before. Jessica dominated the conversation throughout dinner, regaling us with stories about her yoga classes and her book club, where apparently all the women were married to successful professionals. She mentioned their upcoming vacation to Europe, their plans to renovate their kitchen, and their children's enrollment in exclusive private programs. Every anecdote seemed designed to showcase their affluent lifestyle. What struck me most was how she spoke about their life without any acknowledgement of how they were able to afford such luxuries. Daniel worked as a mid-level manager at a tech company, a decent job but hardly the kind that funded European vacations and private school tuition. Yet Jessica spoke as if their comfortable lifestyle was solely the result of their own hard work and good fortune. I knew better. I knew because I had been quietly supporting them for years in ways they had conveniently forgotten or chosen to ignore. When they bought their first house, I had provided the down payment, telling them it was an early inheritance. When Daniel was laid off 2 years ago, I had discreetly paid their mortgage for 6 months while he job hunted. When little Emma needed surgery for appendicitis, I had covered the medical bills that their insurance didn't pay. None of these contributions were ever acknowledged or discussed. They had become invisible acts of love that I performed from the shadows, wanting my children to feel secure and successful without feeling indebted to their mother. I had thought I was being generous and selfless. Now I realized I had been enabling, a level of entitlement that had grown into something ugly. After dinner, as I began clearing the table, Jessica remained seated, scrolling through her phone while the children played in the living room. Rachel immediately stood to help, but Jessica didn't even look up from her screen. When I made a comment about the children being welcome to take some pie home, Jessica finally glanced up. "Oh, we're trying to cut back on sugar in their diet." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It's not good for developing minds. You understand, Eleanor. Things are different now than when you were raising children. We know so much more about nutrition and child development. Each word was like a carefully placed needle, designed to remind me that I was outdated, that my methods were obsolete, that my experience was worthless. The implication that I had somehow failed as a mother because I occasionally let my children have dessert was particularly galling. Thomas and Rachel excused themselves early, with Rachel whispering an apology as they left. I could see the embarrassment in my younger son's eyes, but also a helplessness. He knew his brother's wife was out of line, but family dynamics are complicated, and he didn't want to start a war. As Daniel's family prepared to leave, Jessica breezed through the house like she was conducting an inspection. She commented on how the furniture was looking dated, how the kitchen could use updating, and how the guest bathroom wallpaper was very retro. Each observation was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who believed they were offering helpful advice. The final straw came as they were putting on their coats. Emma had found an old photo album and was looking at pictures of Daniel as a child. Jessica glanced over and made a dismissive sound. "Danny looks so skinny in these old pictures. Good thing we're making sure our children eat properly and stay healthy. It's amazing what proper nutrition can do. She was criticizing how I had fed my own child, suggesting that I had somehow starved or malnourished Daniel. The boy who had grown into a successful, healthy adult was apparently a testament to my failures as a mother, according to his wife. I hugged my grandchildren goodbye, holding them perhaps a bit tighter than usual. As I watched their car disappear down the street, I stood in my doorway feeling more alone than I had since my husband left. But beneath the hurt and anger was something else, something that surprised me with its clarity and strength. For the first time in years, I was seeing my situation with perfect, undiluted truth. That night, I sat in my study surrounded by boxes of financial documents, tax returns, and legal papers. I had always been meticulous about record-keeping, a habit from my bookkeeping career that had served me well in managing my personal affairs. As I sorted through the papers, a complete picture began to emerge. The house Daniel and Jessica lived in had been purchased with my money. Not just the down payment, but subsequent payments when they struggled with the mortgage. The deed bore both their names, but the financial reality was far different from the legal paperwork. I had documentation for every contribution, every payment, every loan that had never been repaid. Their comfortable lifestyle was built on a foundation of my financial support that had been accepted without gratitude and without acknowledgement. They lived in comfort while treating me like an elderly burden whose opinions were outdated and whose presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. But what Jessica didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my financial situation was far more complex than anyone realized. My late mother had been a woman of modest means who lived simply and saved diligently. When she passed 5 years ago, she left me her estate, including several rental properties and a substantial investment portfolio that she had been quietly building for decades. I had inherited not just money, but income-producing assets that had continued to grow under careful management. My mother had taught me the value of financial discretion, of never flaunting wealth or using money as a weapon. I had followed her example, living modestly and helping my children without making them feel small or dependent. The monthly rental income from my mother's properties, combined with my own savings and investments, meant that I was financially secure in ways my children couldn't imagine. I had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life, to travel, to pursue hobbies, to enjoy the retirement I had worked so hard to earn. Yet I had chosen to spend that money on my children instead, believing that their happiness and security were more important than my own comfort. I had subsidized their lifestyle while living in my modest family home, driving my older car, and shopping carefully. I had thought I was being a good mother. Instead, I had created monsters. As I reviewed the financial records, another reality became clear. The amount of money I had given to Daniel and Jessica over the years was staggering. Between the house payments, the medical bills, the emergency loans, and the countless smaller contributions, I had essentially funded their entire adult life. They owed me more money than most people see in a lifetime, money that had been given, freely and lovingly, with no expectation of repayment. But that generosity had been met with disrespect, condescension, and cruelty. They had taken my sacrifices for granted and treated me like a nuisance. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my lawyer, Margaret Wong, a sharp woman in her 50s who had helped me manage my mother's estate. Margaret had been encouraging me for years to be more assertive about family financial boundaries, but I had always brushed off her concerns. "Eleanor, I'm so glad you called," Margaret said when I reached her. "What can I do for you?" "I need to discuss some family financial matters. Specifically, I want to understand my legal options regarding money I've provided to my son and his wife over the years." There was a pause, and I could almost hear Margaret's satisfied smile through the phone. "I've been waiting for this call for years. When would you like to meet?" We scheduled an appointment for the following Monday. That weekend, I began documenting every instance of disrespect, every casual cruelty, every moment when Jessica had made me feel small and unwanted. In my own home, the pattern was clear and undeniable. This wasn't just about a thoughtless comment at Thanksgiving dinner. This was about years of systematic disrespect. I also began making some calls to old friends, people I had lost touch with over the years, because I had been so focused on being available for my children. It was time to rebuild my own life, to stop defining myself solely as Daniel and Thomas's mother. When I met with Margaret on Monday, she reviewed my financial records with the thoroughness I had come to expect from her. After 2 hours of going through documents, she leaned back in her chair with a grave expression. "Eleanor, you have grounds for legal action if you choose to pursue it. The amount of money involved, combined with the pattern of accepted support, creates a clear case for debt recovery. However, before we discuss legal options, I want you to think carefully about what you really want to achieve here." I had been thinking about little else for days. I want them to understand that their comfortable life has been subsidized by someone they treat with contempt. I want them to face the consequences of their behavior. And I want my grandchildren to see that actions have consequences even within families. Margaret nodded slowly. "There are several approaches we could take. The most direct would be to demand immediate repayment of all loans and contributions. Given the amounts involved, this would likely force them into bankruptcy or require the sale of their home." The thought of my grandchildren losing their home was painful, but I reminded myself that their current home was only possible because of my generosity. What other options do I have? We could structure a repayment plan that allows them to keep the house while acknowledging the debt. However, this would require them to accept responsibility for what they owe, which might be difficult for people who seem to have convinced themselves that their lifestyle is entirely self-funded. I thought about Jessica's casual cruelty, her assumption that she could treat me however she wanted without consequences. I think they need to understand the reality of their situation before they can make any meaningful changes. Margaret began preparing a comprehensive financial statement documenting every contribution I had made to Daniel and Jessica's household over the years. The total was even larger than I had calculated, including interest and the opportunity cost of money that could have been invested elsewhere. While Margaret worked on the legal documentation, I began making changes in my own life. I enrolled in a watercolor painting class I had been considering for years. I booked a trip to Ireland, something I had always dreamed of doing but had never pursued because I was always saving money for the children's needs. Most importantly, I stopped the automatic transfers that had been supplementing Daniel and Jessica's mortgage payments. They didn't know about these monthly contributions, so the sudden absence wouldn't be immediately noticed. But within a few months, they would begin to feel the financial pressure. I also began subtly changing how I interacted with them. When Jessica called to ask if I could babysit the children so she could attend a spa day with her friends, I politely declined, saying I had other plans. When Daniel asked if I could help with car repairs, I suggested he contact his insurance company or look into financing options. For the first time in years, I was putting my own needs first, and it felt both liberating and terrifying. I had defined myself as a giver for so long that learning to say no felt like betraying my fundamental nature. But I was beginning to understand that my endless giving hadn't made my children more grateful or more loving. Instead, it had made them entitled and selfish. The changes didn't go unnoticed. Within a few weeks, Jessica called to complain that I seemed distant and wasn't being as helpful as usual. She accused me of punishing them for some imagined slight, and when I calmly asked her to specify what she thought I was upset about, she became flustered and defensive. "I don't know, Eleanor. You're just acting weird lately, like you're too good for us or something. It's not like we've done anything wrong." The complete lack of self-awareness was stunning. She genuinely seemed to believe that her behavior at Thanksgiving had been perfectly acceptable, That treating me like an elderly burden who needed to be managed was normal family interaction. "I'm simply focusing on my own life for a change," I told her. "I'm 62 years old, Jessica. It's time I started living for myself instead of always being available to solve other people's problems." "But that's what mothers do," she protested. "They help their children. It's not like we're asking for anything unreasonable." That conversation crystallized everything for me. In Jessica's mind, my role was to provide assistance without expecting respect in return. I was supposed to be grateful for the opportunity to serve, and any assertion of my own needs was selfish and inappropriate. I began to wonder how Daniel truly felt about his wife's treatment of me. Did he share her views, or was he simply too weak to stand up to her? Either way, his silence made him complicit in the disrespect. The son I had raised to be strong and principled had become a man who allowed his wife to bully his mother. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, Margaret called with news that the legal documentation was complete. She had prepared a comprehensive debt statement that detailed every financial contribution I had made to Daniel and Jessica's household, along with a formal demand for acknowledgement and repayment. "Eleanor, once we serve this document, there's no going back. Your relationship with your son and his family will be permanently changed. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want to do?" I thought about Emma and Marcus, about Thanksgiving, dinner, about years of casual disrespect and taken for granted generosity. "Yes, Margaret, it's time they face the truth about their situation." The document was served on a Tuesday morning while Daniel was at work. Jessica received it from a process server who explained that she had been served with legal papers regarding outstanding debts. According to the server, she initially tried to refuse the papers, claiming there must be some mistake. The phone call came within an hour. Jessica was hysterical, screaming about lawyers and threatening to call the police. She demanded to know what I thought I was doing and accused me of losing my mind. Through her rage, I could hear genuine fear. For the first time, she was beginning to understand that her comfortable life might not be as secure as she had believed. "Eleanor, this is insane. You can't sue your own family over money. That's not how families work." "Interesting," I replied calmly. "I was under the impression that families treat each other with respect and kindness. Perhaps we have different definitions of how families should work." Daniel called next, his voice tight with stress and confusion. "Mom? What's going on? Jessica's in tears, saying you're trying to take our house. There has to be some misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding, Daniel. The papers detail every dollar I've contributed to your household over the years. I think it's time you and Jessica understood exactly how your lifestyle has been funded." "But that money was gifts. You never said anything about repayment." "I never said anything about a lot of things, Daniel. I never said anything about the disrespect, the casual cruelty, the way your wife treats me like an unwanted burden. But silence doesn't mean acceptance." The conversation that followed was painful, but necessary. Daniel tried every argument he could think of. He accused me of being vindictive, of punishing Jessica for one thoughtless comment. He pleaded with me to consider the children, to think about family unity, to remember all the good times we had shared. But when I asked him directly whether he thought Jessica's behavior toward me was acceptable, he couldn't give me a straight answer. He deflected, minimized, and made excuses, but he couldn't bring himself to defend his wife's actions or to acknowledge that they were wrong. That conversation told me everything I needed to know about where my son's loyalties lay. He wasn't weak or trapped in a difficult situation. He was complicit in the disrespect because it served his interests. As long as I was providing financial support and his wife was keeping me in my place, the arrangement worked perfectly for him. The legal documentation had given Jessica and Daniel 30 days to respond to the debt claim. They could acknowledge the debt and propose a repayment plan. They could dispute the amounts claimed, or they could ignore the demand and face formal legal proceedings. In the meantime, I continued rebuilding my own life. I had lunch with college friends I hadn't seen in years, started attending a book club at the local library, and began planning my trip to Ireland. For the first time since becoming a mother, I was living for myself, and it felt wonderful. The changes didn't go unnoticed by Thomas and Rachel. My younger son called to check on me, having heard through family channels that there was some kind of dispute with Daniel. I explained the situation honestly, showing him the financial records and the legal documentation. Thomas was quiet for a long time after I finished. Finally, he said, "Mom, I had no idea you'd been supporting them to that extent. I mean, I knew you helped out sometimes, but this is incredible." I thought I was being a good mother, I told him. I wanted my children to feel secure and successful. I never realized I was creating a dependency that they would come to see as an entitlement. What Jessica said at Thanksgiving was way out of line, Thomas continued. Rachel and I talked about it afterward, and we couldn't believe Daniel just sat there and let her talk to you like that. It was validating to hear that my perception of the situation wasn't distorted by hurt feelings or misunderstanding. Even other family members had recognized the inappropriate nature of Jessica's behavior. As the 30-day deadline approached, I wondered how Daniel and Jessica would respond. Part of me hoped they would acknowledge their debt and their disrespect, that this crisis might lead to a genuine reconciliation built on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. But a larger part of me suspected they would continue to see themselves as victims, unable to accept responsibility for either their financial situation or their behavior toward me. The entitlement that had grown over years of unchallenged support wouldn't disappear easily. Either way, I was prepared for whatever came next. For the first time in decades, I was living my life on my own terms, and that felt more valuable than any amount of money I had given away over the years. The woman who had been afraid to ask for a full plate at her own Thanksgiving dinner was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and wouldn't accept anything less than the respect she deserved. The response from Daniel and Jessica came not through their lawyers, but through a surprise visit on a rainy Thursday evening. I was in my study working on a watercolor painting when I heard the aggressive pounding on my front door. Through the peephole, I could see Jessica's face twisted with rage, Daniel standing slightly behind her, looking uncomfortable but determined. I took my time answering, setting down my brush and wiping my hands carefully before walking to the door. When I opened it, Jessica immediately pushed past me into the house without invitation, her heels clicking angrily against the hardwood floor. "We need to talk, Eleanor. This whole lawsuit thing ends now." Her voice was shrill with barely controlled fury, and I could see Daniel wincing at his wife's tone. "You're embarrassing our entire family with this nonsense." I closed the door slowly and turned to face them, noting how they had positioned themselves in my living room as if they owned the space. Jessica stood with her arms crossed, radiating indignation, while Daniel shifted nervously from foot to foot, unable to meet my eyes. "Please sit down," I said calmly, gesturing toward the sofa. "Would you like some coffee or tea?" "We're not here for a social visit," Jessica snapped. "We're here to put an end to this ridiculous legal harassment. You can't seriously expect us to pay back money that was given as gifts between family members." I settled into my favorite armchair, the one where I had read countless bedtime stories to both my sons when they were young. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now facing one of those sons as an adversary, rather than someone I had nurtured and protected. The documentation shows quite clearly that none of those contributions were characterized as gifts at the time, I replied evenly. They were presented as temporary assistance to help you get established. The fact that repayment was never demanded doesn't transform loans into gifts. Daniel finally found his voice, though he still couldn't look directly at me. "Mom, you know we never had any expectation that you wanted that money back. You never mentioned repayment terms or interest rates or anything like that. It's not fair to suddenly change the rules." "What's not fair, Daniel?" is taking hundreds of thousands of dollars from someone and then treating them like they're worthless. What's not fair is building your entire lifestyle on my financial support while your wife insults me in my own home." Jessica's face flushed red. "One comment about portion sizes and you're trying to destroy our family? That's completely insane, Eleanor. You're being vindictive and petty over nothing." The dismissal of her cruelty as nothing confirmed everything I had come to understand about Jessica's character. In her mind, she had done nothing wrong because my feelings and dignity were nothing to her. I was simply a resource to be managed, not a person worthy of respect. "Jessica, in the past 5 years, you have criticized my cooking, my decorating, my clothes, my age, my body, my parenting, and my lifestyle. You have made it clear repeatedly that you consider me outdated, irrelevant, and burdensome. The Thanksgiving comment was simply the final straw in a pattern of disrespect that I will no longer tolerate." She opened her mouth to argue, but I continued before she could speak. "More importantly, you have done all of this while living in a house I bought, driving cars I helped finance, sending your children to programs I paid for, and taking vacations funded by my money. The hypocrisy is breathtaking." Daniel stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "Mom, I don't understand why you're doing this. We're family. Families help each other without keeping score." "You're absolutely right, Daniel. Families do help each other. They also treat each other with love and respect. They don't allow one member to be systematically degraded by another. They don't stand silently while someone who has sacrificed everything for them is treated like garbage." "I never treated you like garbage." Daniel turned to face me, his voice rising. "I've always been grateful for everything you've done. Then why didn't you defend me when your wife insulted me at Thanksgiving? Why didn't you speak up when she criticized my parenting? Why didn't you ever tell her that her behavior toward me was unacceptable?" The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. But no, words came. He couldn't answer because there was no acceptable answer. He had chosen his wife's comfort over his mother's dignity again and again. Jessica, however, had no such moment of introspection. "Eleanor, you're being ridiculous. I was just trying to help with your health. Older people do need to be more careful about their diet and portion sizes. It's medical fact." "Jessica, I am a 62-year-old woman in excellent health. I walk 3 miles every day, I maintain a healthy weight, and my last physical was perfect. Your comment had nothing to do with my health and everything to do with putting me in what you consider my proper place." "That's not true." "Then, explain to me why you feel qualified to monitor my food intake, but not your own husband's. Daniel has gained 30 pounds since college, but I notice you don't police his plate." Jessica's face turned an even deeper shade of red. She hadn't expected me to fight back, to point out the obvious double standards in her behavior. For years, I had absorbed her little cruelties in silence, and she had become comfortable with the dynamic. "This is getting nowhere," Daniel said, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Mom, what do you want from us? What would it take to make this lawsuit go away?" I had been expecting this question and had spent considerable time thinking about my answer. "I want acknowledgement. I want you both to publicly admit that your lifestyle has been subsidized by my financial support. I want you to acknowledge the disrespectful behavior and commit to changing it. And I want a formal repayment plan for the money you owe me." "Publicly admit?" Jessica's voice rose to a near shriek. "You want us to humiliate ourselves in front of our friends and neighbors? That's sick, Eleanor. That's not about justice. That's about revenge." "No, Jessica. Justice would be you facing the natural consequences of your choices without my protection. Justice would be you learning to live within your actual means instead of the inflated lifestyle I've been funding. What I'm offering is mercy disguised as accountability." Daniel ran his hands through his hair. a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was stressed or confused. Mom, you're asking for things that could ruin our reputation, our standing in the community. People will think we're deadbeats, or that we've been lying about our success. Haven't you been lying about your success? Your house, your cars, your vacations, your children's activities, all of it has been funded by money from me. The reputation you're worried about losing is based on a false foundation. The truth hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. They couldn't deny what I was saying because every word was documented and provable. Their comfortable life, their social status, their ability to keep up with their affluent neighbors, all of it was built on my generosity. Jessica finally exploded. Fine. You want to know the truth? Yes, you've helped us financially over the years. But that doesn't give you the right to control our lives or demand that we grovel for your approval. You chose to help us, Eleanor. No one forced you to give us money. You're absolutely right. I chose to help you because I loved my son and wanted him to be happy. But I didn't choose to be disrespected and degraded in return. I didn't choose to become the target of your insecurities and cruelties. My insecurities? Jessica's voice was dangerously high now. You think I'm insecure? I have a master's degree in marketing, Eleanor. I run a successful consulting business. I don't need to be insecure around someone who spent her whole life cleaning other people's houses and balancing their checkbooks. The mask was finally slipping. This was what Jessica really thought of me, what she had always thought. My career, as a bookkeeper, my working-class background, my lack of formal education beyond high school, all of it made me inferior in her eyes. The fact that my inferior status had funded her superior lifestyle was an irony completely lost on her. Daniel looked mortified. Jessica, that's enough. You're way out of line. Am I? Your mother is trying to destroy our family over wounded pride, and I'm out of line for telling the truth about the situation? I stood up slowly, feeling remarkably calm despite the venom being directed at me. Jessica, thank you for clarifying your true feelings. It makes what I have to do next much easier. I walked to my desk and pulled out a folder I had prepared for this exact moment. Inside were photographs and documents I had been saving for the right opportunity. I spread them across the coffee table where both Daniel and Jessica could see them clearly. These are the rental properties I inherited from my mother, 12 units across 3 buildings, all in prime locations downtown. The monthly rental income from these properties alone is more than Daniel's annual salary. Jessica's face went pale as she looked at the photographs of the well-maintained buildings and the rental income statements. That's impossible. You live in this old house. You drive that ancient car. You don't live like someone who has rental properties. This is called living within your means, Jessica. It's called not flaunting your wealth or using money to make other people feel small. It's called understanding that your worth as a person isn't determined by your possessions or your income. I pulled out another set of documents. These are my investment portfolios, municipal bonds, blue-chip stocks, mutual funds. My mother was a very wise woman who understood the power of compound interest and long-term investing. Daniel was staring at the papers in shock. Mom, I had no idea. Why didn't you ever tell us about any of this? Because I wanted you to build your own life, to feel proud of your own accomplishments. I wanted to help you without making you feel dependent or inferior. I thought that by being discreet about my financial situation, I was preserving your dignity. But instead, Jessica said, her voice now small and shaky, you let us think you were just a retired bookkeeper living on Social Security. I am a retired bookkeeper living partly on Social Security. But I'm also a property owner and investor who could afford to live in a mansion if I chose to. The difference is that I find meaning in relationships and experiences, not in impressing people with expensive things. I gathered up the documents and returned them to the folder. Now you understand the full scope of the situation. The money I've given you over the years represents a tiny fraction of my actual wealth. I could have bought you a house outright. Could have set up trust funds for the children. Could have solved all your financial concerns permanently. Then why didn't you? Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because I wanted you to learn independence, responsibility, and gratitude. I wanted you to understand the value of hard work and the satisfaction of earning your own success. Instead, I created a situation where you took my generosity for granted and allowed your wife to treat me with contempt. The room fell silent, except for the sound of rain against the windows. I could see both of them processing this new information, trying to reconcile the grandmother they had dismissed with the wealthy woman sitting before them. Jessica was the first to recover her composure, though I could see the calculation in her eyes. Eleanor, if you have all this money, then the amount we owe you isn't really significant to you. You could just forgive the debt and we could all move forward as a family. The audacity was stunning. Even faced with the reality of my financial security, she was still trying to manipulate the situation to her advantage. She couldn't apologize for her behavior or acknowledge her mistakes, but she could immediately pivot to finding a way to benefit from this new information. Jessica, the amount of money involved has never been the issue. This is about respect, accountability, and consequences. You can't treat people badly and then expect them to subsidize your lifestyle indefinitely. But we're family, Daniel said, echoing his wife's sentiment. Shouldn't family forgive each other and move forward? Forgiveness requires acknowledgement of wrongdoing and genuine remorse. It requires a commitment to change problematic behavior. What I'm hearing from both of you is justification, minimization, and attempts to manipulate me into continuing the same dysfunctional dynamic we've had for years. I walked to the window and looked out at the rain, thinking about the conversation I had had with Margaret earlier that week. She had warned me that this confrontation would be difficult, that people who had become accustomed to entitlement rarely gave it up gracefully. I want to tell you both something, I said, turning back to face them. When I was your age, Daniel, I thought that love meant sacrifice. I thought that being a good mother meant putting my children's needs ahead of my own, always and without question. I gave up my social life, my hobbies, my dreams, my financial security, all in service of being the best mother I could be. Daniel's face softened slightly. Mom, you were a great mother. I never doubted that you loved us. But love without boundaries isn't really love, Daniel. It's enablement. It's codependency. It's teaching people that they can take whatever they want without giving anything back. I thought I was showing you love, but I was actually preventing you from learning how to be a loving, respectful person yourself. Jessica stood up abruptly. This is getting us nowhere. Eleanor, you've made your point. You have money, you helped us financially, and you feel disrespected. Fine. What exactly do you want from us right now? I want you both to leave my house and think seriously about whether you're capable of the kind of relationship I'm willing to have going forward. A relationship based on mutual respect, honesty, and genuine appreciation rather than financial dependency and entitlement. And if we're not? Daniel asked quietly. Then you'll need to figure out how to maintain your current lifestyle without my assistance, and how to repay the money you owe me according to the legal timeline Margaret has established. Jessica grabbed her purse and headed for the door. This is insane. You're choosing money over family, Eleanor. You're going to destroy everything over hurt feelings and pride. No, Jessica. You destroyed this family years ago with your disrespect and cruelty. I'm simply refusing to continue funding my own mistreatment. Daniel lingered for a moment after his wife had stormed out. Mom, I'm sorry about what Jessica said at Thanksgiving. You're right that I should have spoken up. I don't know how to handle conflict between the two of you. Daniel, you're 33 years old. You have 2 children who are watching how you treat the people you claim to love. What are you teaching them about respect, about loyalty, about standing up for what's right? He stood there for a long moment, looking like the confused little boy I remembered from his childhood. I don't know, Mom. I honestly don't know. After they left, I sat in my study feeling emotionally drained but oddly relieved. The confrontation had been difficult, but it had also been clarifying. There was no ambiguity left about where everyone stood or what the real issues were. I called Margaret to update her on the conversation. She listened without interruption, as I recounted the evening's events, taking notes and asking occasional clarifying questions. Eleanor, based on what you've told me, I don't think they're going to respond reasonably to the debt claim. Jessica's reaction suggests that she still sees herself as the victim in this situation, and Daniel seems too conflicted to take a strong position either way. What does that mean practically? It means we should prepare for formal legal proceedings. They have 2 weeks left to respond to our initial demand. If they don't provide an acceptable proposal, we'll file a civil suit to recover the debt. The prospect of taking my own son to court was painful, but it also felt necessary. I had spent decades avoiding conflict, accommodating unreasonable behavior, and prioritizing peace over justice. The result had been a family dynamic that was toxic and unsustainable. Margaret, I want you to proceed with whatever legal action is necessary, but I also want to explore other options. What kind of other options? I want to understand what it would take to reclaim the house. If they can't or won't pay back the money they owe me, I want to explore recovering the property itself. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Eleanor, that's a nuclear option. If we successfully reclaim the house, they'll be facing immediate homelessness. Are you prepared for the consequences of that action? I thought about Emma and Marcus, about their innocent faces and their trust in the adults around them. The idea of them losing their home was heartbreaking. But I also thought about the lessons they were learning from their parents' behavior, about what it meant to let disrespect and entitlement go unchallenged. Margaret, I need to understand all of my options. I'm not saying I want to take their house away, but I want to know if that's a possibility if they continue to refuse accountability. I'll research the legal pathways for property recovery based on unpaid debt. Given the amounts involved and the documentation we have, it's definitely possible. But Eleanor, once we start down that road, there's no going back. Your relationship with your son and grandchildren will be permanently damaged. My relationship with them is already damaged, Margaret. The question is whether it can be repaired on terms that don't require me to accept ongoing disrespect and financial exploitation. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking constantly about the conversation with Daniel and Jessica. Their complete inability to accept responsibility for their behavior had been eye-opening, but not entirely surprising. People who had lived with entitlement for years rarely gave it up willingly. What surprised me more was my own sense of peace about the situation. For years, I had been anxious about family gatherings, walking on eggshells to avoid Jessica's criticism, accepting treatment that made me feel small and worthless. Now that the confrontation was out in the open, I felt liberated from the pretense. I also began to notice how much mental and emotional energy I had been spending on managing Jessica's moods and Daniel's avoidance. Without that constant stress, I found myself more relaxed, more creative, more engaged with the world around me. The watercolor painting I had been working on the night they visited was a landscape of the Irish countryside, inspired by photographs from travel websites. Looking at it now, I realized it represented more than just artistic expression. It represented possibility, adventure, and a future that belonged entirely to me. I called the travel agent and confirmed my trip to Ireland, booking a month-long stay that would include painting workshops and historical tours. For the first time in my adult life, I was planning an extended trip without considering anyone else's schedule or needs. When Thomas called to check on me, I told him about the confrontation and about my travel plans. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. "Mom, I'm proud of you," he said finally. "I know this can't be easy, but you're doing the right thing. Rachel and I have talked about it, and we both think Jessica's behavior has been completely out of line for years." "Have you and Rachel ever felt like you needed to compete with Daniel and Jessica financially?" Thomas laughed, but not with humor. "Every family gathering, Mom, Jessica's always talking about their latest purchase or their upcoming vacation or the kids' expensive activities. It's like she's trying to prove something to everyone. Did you know that I've been helping them financially?" I suspected something. Their lifestyle never seemed to match Daniel's salary, and Jessica always acted like money was no object. But I didn't realize the extent of it until you explained everything the other day. I felt a wave of sadness for Thomas, who had apparently spent years feeling inadequate compared to his brother's artificially inflated lifestyle. "I'm sorry if my help to Daniel made you feel like I was playing favorites or that your accomplishments weren't valued. Mom, you've always been fair with both of us. Rachel and I are proud of what we've built together, and we've never expected handouts. Honestly, knowing what I know now, I'm glad we didn't get used to that kind of financial dependence." The conversation with Thomas reinforced my conviction that I was handling the situation correctly. Healthy adult children didn't expect their parents to subsidize their lifestyle indefinitely. They didn't allow their spouses to disrespect their parents. They didn't take generosity for granted or treat kindness as weakness. 3 days before the deadline for Daniel and Jessica to respond to the debt claim, Jessica called me. Her voice was different, more controlled, almost businesslike. "Eleanor, I want to propose a solution that could work for everyone," she said without preamble. "I'm listening." "Daniel and I have been talking, and we realize that our communication has been problematic. We're willing to acknowledge that we owe you money for the various times you've helped us financially." This was more progress than I had expected, though I noted that she still couldn't bring herself to acknowledge the disrespectful behavior. "Go on. We'd like to propose a repayment plan that allows us to keep the house while paying you back over time. We're thinking maybe $200 a month for the next few years." I almost laughed out loud. $200 a month wouldn't even cover the interest on what they owed me, much less make meaningful progress toward the principal. At that rate, it would take them over a century to repay the debt. "Jessica, the amount you owe me is over $400,000. $200 a month would take you 166 years to repay, assuming no interest." There was silence on the other end of the line. "Well, what do you think would be reasonable?" "I think a reasonable payment would be approximately $3,000 a month, which would allow you to repay the debt in 12 to 15 years with interest." $3,000 a month? Eleanor, that's impossible. That's more than our current mortgage payment. We can't afford that. Then perhaps you should consider selling the house and downsizing to something within your actual means. You're asking us to give up our home, our lifestyle, everything we've worked for. Jessica, everything you've worked for was built on my money. You haven't given up anything that was truly yours to begin with." The conversation deteriorated quickly from there, with Jessica alternating between pleading and threats. She suggested that I was being vindictive, that I was punishing the children for their parents' mistakes, that I was destroying the family over money. When I remained unmoved by her arguments, she tried a different approach. "Eleanor, what if we agreed to family counseling? We could work on our communication issues with a professional mediator." "Jessica, this isn't a communication issue. This is a respect issue and an accountability issue. No amount of counseling is going to change. The fact that you owe me hundreds of thousands of dollars, or that your behavior toward me has been consistently cruel and degrading." "Fine," she said, her voice turning cold again. "If that's how you want to play this, we'll see you in court. But don't expect us to just roll over and let you destroy our family." After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen thinking about the conversation. Jessica still saw herself as the victim, still believed that she was being unfairly persecuted for minor social infractions. The possibility that her behavior had been genuinely hurtful and unacceptable was completely outside her frame of reference. More troubling was her threat about seeing me in court. It suggested that she and Daniel were planning to fight the debt claim rather than work toward a reasonable resolution. That meant we were heading for a protracted legal battle that would be expensive, emotionally draining, and publicly embarrassing for everyone involved. But I was no longer the conflict-avoidant woman who had absorbed years of disrespect and silence. If Jessica wanted a fight, she would discover that she had seriously underestimated her opponent. I had resources, documentation, and most importantly, the moral clarity that comes from finally standing up for yourself after years of mistreatment. The deadline passed without any formal response from Daniel and Jessica. Margaret called to confirm that we had received nothing through official channels, which meant we could proceed with filing the civil suit. "Eleanor, this is your last chance to reconsider. Once we file this lawsuit, it becomes a matter of public record. There will be no privacy, no opportunity to resolve things quietly within the family." I thought about Emma and Marcus, about the disruption this would cause in their young lives. But I also thought about the lessons they were learning from their parents' behavior, about what it meant to let disrespect and entitlement go unchallenged generation after generation. Margaret, file the lawsuit. It's time they face the consequences of their choices. The courthouse steps felt solid beneath my feet as I walked toward the entrance on a crisp Monday morning in March. Margaret walked beside me, her briefcase in one hand and a confident smile on her face. After months of legal, maneuvering, depositions, and failed settlement negotiations, today was the day we would finally get our resolution. Daniel and Jessica were already inside with their attorney, a young man fresh out of law school who had taken their case on a contingency basis. I had learned through Margaret that they had struggled to find representation, largely because their position was legally untenable and financially unrewarding. No experienced attorney wanted to take a case they were almost certain to lose. The months leading up to this day had been a whirlwind of revelations, both legal and personal. The lawsuit had indeed become public record, and the local newspaper had picked up the story with the headline, "Local Woman Sues Son and Daughter-in-Law for $400,000. The article was factual but sensational, focusing on the unusual nature of a mother taking legal action against her own child. The public reaction had been mixed, but largely supportive of my position. Online comments ranged from outrage at Jessica's behavior to admiration for my courage in standing up for myself. Several people shared their own stories of being financially exploited by entitled family members, creating a broader conversation about boundaries and accountability within families. What I hadn't expected was how the publicity would affect Daniel and Jessica's social circle. Jessica's book club had quietly stopped including her in their gatherings. The country club where they had been members had politely suggested that their membership might be better suited elsewhere. Parents at Emma and Marcus's school had begun treating them with a mixture of pity and judgment that was clearly affecting the children. I felt terrible about the impact on my grandchildren, but I also recognized that they were learning valuable lessons about consequences and accountability. Emma, now 8 years old, had surprised everyone by asking during a family dinner why her parents had been mean to Grandma Eleanor. The innocent directness of her question had apparently reduced Jessica to tears and sent Daniel storming out of the room. Thomas had kept me informed about these developments through his occasional conversations with Daniel. My younger son had tried to serve as a mediator, encouraging Daniel to settle the lawsuit and repair his relationship with me. But Jessica had remained adamant that they were the victims of my vindictive overreaction, and Daniel continued to defer to his wife's judgment. The most shocking development had come 3 weeks before the trial date, when Margaret received a call from a private investigator who had been hired by Daniel and Jessica's attorney. They had been attempting to find evidence that I was mentally incompetent or that my financial records were somehow fraudulent. The investigation had backfired spectacularly when the investigator discovered additional assets that even I had forgotten about. My mother, it turned out, had been even more financially astute than I had realized. In addition to the rental properties and investment portfolios I knew about, she had also purchased several small parcels of land on the outskirts of the city decades earlier. With urban expansion, those parcels were now worth nearly $2 million in development potential. When Margaret presented this information to the court as part of our financial disclosure, Daniel and Jessica's attorney had immediately requested a settlement conference. The realization that I was worth significantly more than they had calculated, combined with the strength of our legal position, had finally penetrated their wall of denial. The settlement negotiations had been tense and ultimately unsuccessful. I had offered to forgive half the debt in exchange for a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a structured repayment plan for the remainder. Jessica had rejected this offer outright, apparently still believing that an apology would be an admission of weakness rather than an opportunity for reconciliation. Daniel had seemed more willing to consider the settlement, but he was clearly caught between his wife's intransigence and his growing understanding of the legal and financial reality they were facing. In the end, his inability to stand up to Jessica had doomed any possibility of compromise. Now, as we entered the courtroom, I felt a mixture of sadness and determination. This wasn't how I had wanted things to end, but it was the natural consequence of years of enablement and avoidance. Sometimes love required setting boundaries, even when those boundaries were painful for everyone involved. Judge Patricia Coleman was a woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair and a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency. She had presided over numerous family financial disputes and had little patience for emotional manipulation or legal gamesmanship. Margaret had been pleased when we learned she would be hearing our case. The proceedings began with opening statements. Margaret's presentation was crisp and factual, outlining the history of financial support I had provided to Daniel and Jessica, the documentation supporting our debt claim, and the pattern of behavior that had led to this legal action. She focused on the objective financial evidence rather than the emotional aspects of the case. Daniel and Jessica's attorney, by contrast, attempted to paint me as a vindictive mother using money to control her adult children. He argued that the financial support had been given as gifts within a loving family relationship, and that I was now attempting to weaponize that generosity after a minor family disagreement. Judge Coleman listened impassively to both presentations, occasionally making notes but showing no indication of her thoughts on the case. When the opening statements concluded, she called for the presentation of evidence. Margaret began by introducing the financial records documenting every contribution I had made to Daniel and Jessica's household over the years. Bank statements, canceled checks, wire transfer records, and loan documents painted a comprehensive picture of systematic financial support that totaled just over $420,000. The defense attorney attempted to argue that the absence of formal loan agreements proved that the money had been given as gifts. Margaret countered by presenting email correspondence and recorded phone conversations that clearly referenced the temporary nature of the assistance and expectations of eventual repayment. One particularly damaging piece of evidence was a voicemail Daniel had left 2 years earlier, thanking me for loaning them money for Emma's medical expenses and promising to pay you back as soon as we get back on our feet. The use of the word loaning undermined their entire argument about the money being gifts. When it came time for witness testimony, Jessica took the stand first. Her attorney had apparently coached her extensively because she presented a much more controlled version of herself than I had seen in our private interactions. She spoke about family relationships, the importance of forgiveness, and her belief that parents should support their children without expecting anything in return. Margaret's cross-examination was devastating. She methodically went through specific instances of Jessica's disrespectful behavior, using documentation and witness statements to build a case that the financial support had been accompanied by systematic emotional abuse. Jessica's attempts to minimize or justify her actions only made her look more callous and entitled. The moment that sealed Jessica's fate came when Margaret asked her about the Thanksgiving dinner comment that had triggered this entire legal action. Jessica initially claimed she couldn't remember making any inappropriate remarks, then tried to reframe her comment as health-conscious advice given out of love and concern. Margaret then played a recording that Thomas had made on his phone during the dinner. I hadn't known about this recording until Margaret discovered it during the discovery process. Hearing Jessica's voice dripping with condescension as she told me I didn't need a full plate at my age, followed by the uncomfortable silence from the rest of the family, was devastating to her credibility. Daniel's testimony was equally problematic for their case. His attorney had clearly hoped he would present as a sympathetic son caught between a demanding mother and a protective wife. Instead, Daniel came across as weak and evasive, unable to defend his wife's behavior, but also unwilling to take responsibility for his own role in the family dysfunction. When Margaret asked him directly whether he believed his mother deserved to be treated with respect in her own home, Daniel's long pause and stammered non-answer spoke volumes. Judge Coleman's expression during this exchange suggested she was forming definite opinions about the character of the defendants. My own testimony was the most emotionally difficult part of the trial. Margaret had prepared me extensively, but recounting years of disrespect and ingratitude while looking at my son across the courtroom was heartbreaking. I focused on the facts, rather than my feelings, describing specific incidents and their impact on my willingness to continue providing financial support. The defense attorney's cross-examination attempted to portray me as a controlling mother who used money to manipulate her children. His questions about why I had been secretive about my wealth and why I had never established formal loan agreements were designed to suggest hidden motives and manipulation. I answered honestly that I had wanted to help my children without making them feel dependent or indebted. I explained that I had hoped generosity and love would be met with gratitude and respect, not entitlement and cruelty. When he asked if I was using this lawsuit to punish Jessica for hurting my feelings, I looked directly at Judge Coleman as I answered, "Your Honor, this lawsuit is about accountability. If someone borrows money and refuses to pay it back, that's a legal matter regardless of the family relationship. If someone systematically disrespects and degrades the person who has been financially supporting their lifestyle, that person has every right to stop providing that support. I'm not punishing anyone. I'm simply refusing to continue enabling behavior that has become toxic and destructive." The final witness was Thomas, who testified about his observations of the family dynamics over the years. His testimony was particularly powerful because he had no financial stake in the outcome, and his perspective as Daniel's brother gave him credibility. He described specific instances of Jessica's disrespectful behavior and Daniel's failure to address it, painting a picture of a family system that had become deeply dysfunctional. Closing arguments focused on the central legal question of whether the money had been given as loans or gifts. Margaret argued that the evidence clearly supported the loan interpretation and that the defendant's behavior had justified my decision to demand repayment. She also pointed out that even if some of the money could be considered gifts, the amount that was clearly documented as loans was still substantial enough to justify the legal action. The defense attorney made one final attempt to appeal to family loyalty and forgiveness, arguing that courts should be reluctant to intrude into family financial relationships. He suggested that I was using the legal system to resolve what was essentially a personal conflict, and that the court should encourage reconciliation rather than punishment. Judge Coleman recessed for deliberation, leaving all of us to wait in the courthouse hallway. The tension was palpable as we sat in separate areas, avoiding eye contact and conversation. I watched Daniel pacing nervously while Jessica sat rigidly, in her chair, her face a mask of barely controlled anger. After 90 minutes that felt like hours, we were called back into the courtroom. Judge Coleman's expression was serious as she began to deliver her verdict. This case presents the unfortunate situation of a family financial dispute that has escalated to litigation. However, the court's responsibility is to determine the legal merits of the claims presented, not to mediate family relationships. She continued by outlining her findings of fact, systematically addressing each element of our debt claim. The documentation of financial transfers was overwhelming and undisputed. The evidence supporting the loan rather than gift interpretation was compelling, particularly given the recorded conversations and email correspondence. The court finds that the plaintiff has established by clear and convincing evidence that the defendants received financial assistance totaling $423,000 under circumstances that created a legal obligation for repayment. The defendant's argument that these transfers constituted gifts is not supported by the evidence. Jessica's face went white as Judge Coleman continued. Furthermore, the court notes that the defendant's treatment of the plaintiff, as documented through testimony and recordings, demonstrates a pattern of disrespect and ingratitude that undermines any claim to equitable relief based on family relationships. The judge then addressed the question of remedies. The court orders the defendants to repay the principal amount of $423,000 plus interest calculated at the legal rate from the dates of the original transfers. The total judgment amount is $567,000. Daniel made a choking sound, and Jessica grabbed his arm as if to keep herself from falling. Their attorney was frantically scribbling notes, clearly trying to calculate whether an appeal would be feasible. But Judge Coleman wasn't finished. The court further orders that if the defendants fail to establish a payment plan within 30 days that is acceptable to the plaintiff is entitled to pursue collection through any legal means, including but not limited to asset seizure, wage garnishment, and property liens. The implications were clear. If Daniel and Jessica couldn't come up with an acceptable repayment plan, I could force the sale of their house and other assets to satisfy the judgment. They were facing not just financial ruin, but the very real possibility of homelessness. As we left the courtroom, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in the legal vindication, but also profound sadness that our family relationships had deteriorated to this point. The victory felt hollow when measured against the cost to family unity and the impact on my grandchildren. Margaret was clearly pleased with the outcome, both for professional and personal reasons. She had developed a genuine dislike for Jessica during the legal proceedings and felt that justice had been served. But she also understood my conflicted feelings about the result. "Eleanor, you still have options," she said as we walked to our cars. "The judgment gives you tremendous leverage, but how you use that leverage is entirely up to you. You could still negotiate a settlement that allows them to keep their house if they're willing to acknowledge their mistakes and commit to genuine change." I nodded, but I wasn't optimistic about Daniel and Jessica's willingness to accept accountability even now. The trial had given them multiple opportunities to show remorse, to acknowledge their behavior, to take responsibility for their actions. Instead, they had doubled down on their victimhood narrative and their sense of entitlement. The next few weeks brought a series of frantic phone calls and messages from Daniel. The reality of the judgment had finally penetrated his denial, and he was desperate to find a solution that would allow them to keep their house. His messages alternated between pleading for mercy and anger at what he characterized as my vindictive overreaction. Jessica, by contrast, remained defiant. According to Thomas, she was encouraging Daniel to file for bankruptcy to avoid paying the judgment. She apparently still believed that she had done nothing wrong and that I was the villain in this situation. The bankruptcy threat prompted me to take decisive action. Margaret filed for immediate asset protection, placing liens on their house, cars, and other property to prevent them from hiding assets or transferring ownership to avoid the judgment. The legal net was tightening around them with each passing day. 3 weeks after the judgment, Daniel finally called and asked to meet with me privately. He sounded broken, exhausted, and desperate. Against Margaret's advice, I agreed to see him at my house, the same place where this whole conflict had begun. When Daniel arrived, he looked like he had aged years in the months since the lawsuit began. His face was drawn, his clothes rumpled, and his usual confident demeanor had been replaced by obvious anxiety and stress. For a moment, he looked like the little boy I remembered, and my heart ached for him. "Mom, I need to tell you something," he said as soon as he sat down. "Jessica and I are getting divorced." The announcement stunned me. Despite all their legal and financial problems, I hadn't expected their marriage to collapse. "Daniel, I'm sorry. I never wanted your marriage to end because of this situation. It didn't end because of the lawsuit, Mom. It ended because I finally saw who Jessica really is. The stress of the legal proceedings brought out things about her character that I had been ignoring for years." He went on to explain that Jessica had been pressuring him to cut off all contact with me, to refuse any settlement that included an apology or acknowledgement of wrongdoing. She had also been trying to convince him to hide assets offshore and declare bankruptcy fraudulently to avoid paying the judgment. "She actually suggested that we should have you declared mentally incompetent so we could get control of your money," Daniel said, his voice filled with disgust. "When I refused, she accused me of being weak and said I deserved a mother who treated me like garbage." The revelation that Jessica had wanted to have me declared incompetent was shocking, but not entirely surprising. It was consistent with her pattern of seeing me as an obstacle to be managed rather than a person deserving of respect. "Mom, I know I've made terrible mistakes. I should have stood up to Jessica years ago. I should have defended you. I should have stopped taking your money and learned to live within our means. I was weak, and I let her treat you terribly because it was easier than dealing with the conflict." This was the first time Daniel had ever truly acknowledged his role in the family dysfunction. Hearing him take responsibility for his failures gave me hope that maybe, despite everything that had happened, we could eventually rebuild some kind of relationship. "What do you want to do about the judgment?" I asked. "I want to pay you back every penny with interest. It's going to take me years, maybe decades, but I want to make this right. And Mom, I want you to know that Jessica is going to fight the divorce and try to get as much as she can. She's already talking about claiming that the house should be protected as her primary residence, even though you paid for it." I listened as Daniel outlined his plans for the divorce and his proposals for repaying the debt. He was willing to sell the house and downsize to something he could actually afford. He wanted to establish a formal payment plan that would hold him accountable while allowing him to maintain custody of his children. Most importantly, he seemed to understand that repairing our relationship would require sustained effort and genuine change, not just financial restitution. He asked if I would be willing to attend family counseling with him once the legal issues were resolved. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of hope for our family's future. Daniel's willingness to accept responsibility and make sacrifices to repair the damage gave me reason to believe that reconciliation might be possible. The divorce proceedings were as contentious as Daniel had predicted. Jessica fought viciously for the house, claiming that she had contributed to its value through her unpaid domestic labor and that the children needed stability. Her attorney argued that I should not be allowed to destroy the children's home to satisfy a debt that arose from a family dispute. Margaret countered by presenting evidence that every mortgage payment, property tax bill, and maintenance expense for the house had been paid with money I provided. Jessica's contributions had been entirely theoretical, while mine had been documented and substantial. The family court judge was not sympathetic to Jessica's arguments. She noted that Jessica had known about the financial support throughout the marriage and had benefited from it while treating the benefactor with disrespect. The judge also pointed out that the children's stability would be better served by their father taking responsibility for his debts, rather than continuing to exploit his mother's generosity. In the end, Jessica received a minimal settlement that included temporary spousal support and shared custody of the children. The house was awarded to Daniel with the understanding that he would sell it to satisfy the judgment against me. 6 months after the trial, Daniel moved into a modest rental house in a decent neighborhood. Emma and Marcus adjusted to their new circumstances with the resilience that children often show in difficult situations. They spent weekends with their father and alternating weeks with Jessica, who had moved in with her parents. I began seeing my grandchildren regularly again, both during Daniel's custody time and occasionally when Jessica allowed additional visits. The children seemed to understand that there had been problems between the adults, but they didn't appear to blame me for the changes in their living situation. Daniel established a payment plan that would allow him to repay the debt over 15 years. The monthly payments were substantial enough to be meaningful, but not so large as to prevent him from supporting his children. More importantly, he had started attending counseling to address the patterns of conflict avoidance and people-pleasing that had contributed to our family's dysfunction. Our relationship was slowly healing, built on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect, rather than financial dependency and enablement. Daniel was learning to be proud of what he could accomplish on his own, while I was learning to offer emotional support without solving all his problems with money. Thomas and Rachel had been supportive throughout the entire ordeal, and their relationship had actually grown stronger as they processed the lessons about boundaries and accountability. They were planning to marry in the spring, and I was looking forward to being part of a wedding celebration that was based on love and respect rather than financial anxiety. As for Jessica, I had no contact with her beyond the necessary arrangements for seeing my grandchildren. I had heard through various sources that she was struggling with the social consequences of the lawsuit and divorce. Her reputation in the community had been damaged, and she was apparently having difficulty maintaining the lifestyle she had become accustomed to. I felt no satisfaction in her struggles, but I also felt no obligation to rescue her from the consequences of her choices. She had been given multiple opportunities to acknowledge her behavior and make amends, and she had chosen pride and entitlement over reconciliation and growth. The experience had taught me valuable lessons about love, boundaries, and the difference between helping and enabling. True love sometimes required allowing people to face the consequences of their actions, even when those consequences were painful. Helping someone avoid accountability wasn't kindness. It was a form of cruelty that prevented growth and change. On a warm evening in late spring, I sat on my back porch with Emma and Marcus, watching them play in the garden while Daniel prepared dinner in the kitchen. The scene was peaceful and ordinary, a family gathering without the underlying tension that had characterized our relationships for so many years. Emma ran up to me with a drawing she had made of our family. In her picture, we were all smiling and holding hands, and there was a rainbow over our house. When I complimented her artwork, she climbed into my lap and hugged me tightly. "Grandma, Eleanor, I'm glad you're not sad anymore," she said with the directness that only children possess. "I'm glad too, sweetheart," I replied, realizing that she was right. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking on eggshells or absorbing criticism or feeling anxious about family interactions. I was simply enjoying the company of people who loved and respected me. The legal battle had been painful and expensive, both financially and emotionally. It had cost me my relationship with Jessica and had temporarily damaged my connection with Daniel and the grandchildren. But it had also given me something invaluable: the knowledge that I was worthy of respect and that I had the strength to demand it when necessary. As the sun set over my garden, I thought about the woman I had been before that Thanksgiving dinner, the woman who had silently accepted disrespect because she was afraid of conflict. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that love without boundaries wasn't really love at all. The plate comment that had started this entire journey seemed almost trivial now, but it had been the catalyst for profound change. Sometimes it takes a moment of crystal clarity to see how far we've drifted from our own values and self-worth. Sometimes it takes a crisis to force us to choose between peace and justice, between harmony and honesty. I had chosen justice and honesty, and while the path had been difficult, It had led me to a place of genuine peace. My family was smaller now, but it was also healthier. My relationships were built on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. And most importantly, I had rediscovered my own value as a person worthy of love and kindness. The legal documents from the lawsuit were filed away in my study, a reminder of what it had taken to reclaim my dignity. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom or the financial settlement. The real victory was in the quiet evening scene around me. A grandmother enjoying time with her family, a son taking responsibility for his choices, and children growing up with the understanding that love includes accountability. It had taken 62 years and a legal battle to learn that standing up for yourself wasn't selfish or vindictive. It was essential. And sometimes when someone tells you that you don't need a full plate at your age, the appropriate response is to serve them a full portion of consequences and let them learn what hunger really feels like. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.